I'm keen to get another video out here before the end of the month, and you know, from everybody's comments, people were giving me lots of good ideas for small projects and stuff to do with my gimp leg here. So I'm going to do a scrap wood challenge, and this is going to be kind of a, so I just got this chunk of 2x4. This is just your generic spruce 2x4 from J grade, technically, whatever grade that is. And we're gonna do a joinery demo. So I know a lot of people are like, oh, you know, you got a lot of talent, you know, you cut some amazing joinery, you know, the things you do with your hands are really exceptional. And people wanna see more of that. And so, hey, you gotta give them what they want. So, you know, the thing I struggle with is like a lot of stuff that I've just done or I've done in previous videos, I kind of think like, oh, that's stupid, I shouldn't share that again. But I don't really, you know, there's all sorts of new people that haven't seen my old stuff, haven't seen that I've, you know, built hundreds and hundreds of pieces of furniture and all the different joinery and techniques that I've used. So I'm just going to do a quick little demo on how to cut a wedged through tenon. It's a really, you know, common, beautiful, strong, functional joint. And for those of you who like woodworking and want to learn how to do stuff with like minimal tools, we're going to do this with pretty much hand tools. I'm just going to use an electric drill, you know, to hog out some of the wood in the mortise, but the rest of it's just going to be chisel and handsaw. So let's see if my skills are still as sharp as I think they are. Let's just take a look at some of the tools that we're going to need here, okay? So you can get away with less. This peg leg. So we got a mallet, okay? 2 different size chisels. I think this is about a 1 inch or 7/8 or something like that. It doesn't necessarily, it's just over an inch. These are Japanese chisels, so they're in millimeters. And then I've got about a 10 mil here, 3/8 of an inch-ish, which is really good for doing the fine details and getting into corners and stuff. Okay, so you can get away with 1 chisel if you want. But I find I like 2 chisels, 2 different size chisels, okay? So make sure they're nice and sharp. There's no point in starting joinery work if your chisels are dull or dinged up or anything like that, because it's just gonna look like a dog's breakfast, okay? So we need a mallet, couple sharp chisels. I've got my little rebate plane here that can get right into the corners, which is really handy for planing the tenons and smoothing them out, but you could use a sanding block as well. This gives you a little bit more of a crisp, clean cut compared to a sanding block, but you can still get really good results with a sanding block or even a file. Another thing for doing really accurate joinery is to have a little caliper like this. This is just like a cheap digital one from like Lee Valley Tools. It's only about 30 bucks, I think. So just put the battery in. And so this allows us to measure the thickness of our tenon and then check that with our mortise to make sure our mortise is close, as opposed to you know, trying to dry fit in and out. You can damage the joint, you know, constantly banging and putting the piece together and taking it apart, trying to fit it. So I find you can get a lot closer to your final dimension just by checking with the caliper here, as opposed to, you know, measuring or fitting kind of a thing, right? So we want to have a nice crisp joint. And then these are the Lee Valley Veritas marking gauges. So these give you a nice knife edge, accurate lines to cut to, which obviously in turn gives you much more accurate joinery. So when you're using a pencil, you know, the thickness of the lead itself can be, you know, up to a 1/16 of an inch if you're using one of these big, you know, contractor pencils. I use like a fine mechanical pencil, like a 0.9. But for the most accurate results, using like a dual marking gauge, ooh, man, my voice is just shot. So I've got a few different marking gauges here so that I can set them up for different parts of the joint and not have to, you know, keep changing one. And then we'll need a couple saws. You could probably just get away with one Ryoba saw. So this is a 9.5 inch Gokucho Ryoba saw. It's got cross-cut teeth on one side and rip-cut teeth on the other side. So you can do both ripping and cross-cutting with one saw. This is more of a fine-tooth cross-cut saw, Dazuki saw, so it has a spine on the back so that the blade can't bend, whereas this one is very flexible. But I find that you can get nice, accurate cuts with either style of saw. This is definitely, if you don't have any saws, this is going to be the most useful all-around saw, is the 9.5 inch Ryoba saw. Got a square for marking. And then we'll just need a drill with a Forstner bit to be able to hog out the mortise. So, okay, so first things first, we're gonna start with our tenon. So I've got my little single marking gauge here. So the material we're going through is about 1.5 inches, give or take a 1/16. And then I wanna have about let's say a 2.5 inch through tenon. So we're gonna need a 4 inch overall, right? 2.5 protruding out, 1.5 inches to go through here. So I'm gonna set my gauge to 4 inches. Then we're gonna mark our shoulders all the way around here. Okay, now we're going to reset this jig to 1/4 inch, which is going to be the shoulder measurement. Then we're going to mark that all the way around this way. Our tenon will be just under 1 inch. And because we've marked the tenon this way, now I'm going to take my other marking gauge, the dual marking gauge, and then I can pull these out and they seat into the cuts that I made with my other marking gauge. So I just check them to make sure that they're right, caught on that cut edge. Now that marking gauge is set for the exact width of this tenon. I know that the tenon width is set on this one, so I can go ahead and cut this tenon here. And then I want to get the tenon finished, right? Because say I make a little bit of a mistake and I need to plane a little bit more off of one cheek than the other. I don't want to lay out my mortise until I have that finished tenon, so that way I know that my mortise is going to be exactly what the tenon is. Okay, and now that I've got my scribe lines all the way down the sides, right, on all four sides, I can use those to track with my saw. Okay, so it's about 2:43 now. I'd say we started at about 2:40 laying out. So let's time and see how long it takes to cut this joint. Okay, so to start my saw, I'm going to be using the rip teeth, right? Because we're going with the length of the board. The grain is running longitudinally. So use my rip teeth, and then I use my fingernail, set it in my little scribe mark there, rest my saw against it. So when you're using a pole saw, I find that choking up on the pull saw does not yield the best results. So I hold the saw at the end of the handle, which kind of allows you to keep more tension and feel whether or not the saw is flexing as much. When you're holding up here, I don't know, there's just a little bit too much interference. So you want to hold quite lightly. The saw itself is what's doing the cutting, so it's not necessarily your pressure that's forcing it to cut, because each one of these teeth, you know, has this little triangular cutout behind it. And once that's full of sawdust as it's cutting, right, each one of these little notches is getting clogged up with sawdust. So pushing down harder is not going to make the saw cut faster. If anything, that's just going to cause you to move off of your line and drift in the wrong direction because you're applying too much pressure. So you really want to just have enough pressure just so that the saw teeth are, you know, resting against the wood, and they will kind of cut themselves. So you don't need a lot of pressure, just, you know, a little bit of pressure just to keep the saw biting into the wood, and that's about it. And then the rest you want to really focus on maintaining an even stroke, and not binding or pushing or, you know, drifting your hand too much. So body position is key, right? You want that saw lined up, and I find that the start of your cut is very critical to how well everything is going to go. So if you get a bad start, trying to correct it is almost impossible. So you really want to just focus on getting a good start. Now you can start this way. Some people like to start like that. Some people like to start like that. It's kind of a personal preference thing. I'll do either way, and then I find that, you know, you want to get as close to the line as possible to save on chiseling and planing and that sort of stuff. But you also, if you're not super well versed with the handsaw, maybe give yourself a 1/16 of an inch. That way you got a little bit of wiggle room, so if it does drift in, it's not going to cut into your line. And then you can clean it up with a plane afterwards. But I find that once you've done several, 100 cuts, not to say it takes 700 cuts to get good with a handsaw, but it becomes muscle memory at that point, and you can cut pretty accurately to whatever line you draw once you've done many of them. But you will start to get the hang of it even after just like a dozen or so cuts. So maybe take your scrap and you draw a bunch of square lines across your 2x4 and just focus on practice cutting, cross-cutting your block, you know, cut a whole bunch of pieces. And you'll find after about, you know, 10 or 15 cross cuts that you're starting to feel, you know, where you like to hold the saw, you know, what gives you the best results, and then you gotta work from there, okay? So I find these first, you know, few strokes I do really lightly, just so I can really dial in right along my line there. Because that's what's gonna, you know, guide your saw for the rest of the cut. So if it's crooked, it's gonna force your saw to, you know, drift in whatever direction that it's crooked. So take your time when starting out, and then once you get a good start, then you can kind of lay into it a little bit more and go faster with your strokes.
This video has been made possible by my monthly sponsors: U2 Fasteners, Bass Pro Shops and Cabela's, and Princess Auto. If you want to see what these great retailers have to offer you, please check the links in the description box below. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so this one's drifting for me, but but it's drifting favorably away from the line. Okay. I only drifted about a small 1/16 from end to end there. Okay, so for this crosscut teeth, Now there's kind of a rule of thumb that a lot of people follow is you only cut the lines that you can see, right? So the top line and this sign, you don't cut down here because you can't see if it's gonna drift. I find that if you have this one nice and then you taper it down, you know, you get your saw in there like that. If those two saw curves are not binding your saw blade or anything like that, they're nice and it's a nice even groove, it's very likely going to follow that the rest of the way down, unless you have some really gnarly grain, or you know, if these two cuts are a little bit off, they might be pushing the blade in one direction. So it's up to you whether or not you kind of want to do all the way down this way, or if you trust that the saw is going to kind of track straight, which most of the time when I get, you know, these two cuts straight, it'll track the rest of the way straight as well. So I don't, you know, look so much here, and I just focus on keeping the blade, you know, no weird tension on the saw, just nice even strokes. So that one drifted a hair, maybe a small 16th, but it's all in the right direction away from the line, so I can chisel it down to where I want it. Okay. We've got our tenon roughed out. Now we just need to plane it up. So I find that the shoulder plane here helps a lot with that. All right, so I've marked a center point on this 2x4 here, and then I've adjusted my fence, leaving these the same because they're attached right here. That keeps these two rods at the same distance and then allows you to move the fence without affecting your measurement there. So I've centered the measurement on my center line, and then we also need to check. So we're at about, should be at about 3 inches, just under 3 inches. So let's make a little shoulder mark here. Okay, so having your shoulder marks at each end allows you to not run your knife cuts past where the mortise is going to be, because then those are hard to sand out because they're cut down into the wood, right? So you only want to mark them where you need them. Okay, you also want to transfer those lines around to the other side, because we're going all the way through here. Okay, and because I use the fence on this side, I don't want to flip it over and use it on that side, because if there's a little bit of variation or that's out of square, your joint's going to be crooked, right? So you always want to use the same edge when you mark your joints. All right, so I've got a 3/4 inch Forstner here. The mortise is about 1 inch, so that'll give me about 1/8 on either side that I can chisel down after. Typically I try to get, you know, maybe a 7/8 bit. So that way you only have a 1/16 on each side, but now don't go all the way through, because if your drill is on an angle, you know, it'll just be ugly on the other side as well as blow out. So you want to get as close to the other side as possible and then just stop. Okay, so this is obviously the uglier side here. So this is going to be the inside of our, you know, the mortise, the tenon will go in this way. That way the shoulder will kind of cover this one. So we don't have to worry too much about, you know, we want to make it accurate obviously, but what I do when I'm making my joints, especially by hand, is I try to leave a tiny bit of taper. So the part where the tenon enters is going to be a little bit wider than where it exits on the other side. So that way fitting the joints together is a lot easier because they don't tighten up until you get closer to fitting it. So yeah, it just allows you to get it in there without, you know, having to hammer it or cause too much friction. And yeah, so it just also saves time because you don't have to be super accurate. Chiseling spruce is not nearly as rewarding as hard, but sure you go. Okay. Or hold it anyway. Spruce looks. This is the outside. So this is where the tenon's going to come through, and it's going to be a lot more visible. So we really want to do a nice job here. So you want to work your way up to the line, right? Don't put your chisel right on the line, because if you have a bunch of material on this side of your bevel, when you hammer down, it's going to push the chisel that way, right? Because of the wedge shape. So it'll push it past your line. So you want to get probably within a 1/16 or less, especially with softwood, before you start to really cut that actual chisel line or the scribe line. So I'll kind of work my way up a 1/16 at a time till I'm really close to the line. Having a handy little 6-inch square like this is great, because then you can check your ends for square, right? The material still needs to come out there. As well as your sides. Nice, it's looking good. Now, on the inside of the mortise here, you can even scoop that out a little bit to reduce friction, as opposed to having it perfectly straight, which is fine as well. I find that I'll relieve it a little bit from each side so that there's just contact kind of where the tenon enters and then where it exits there. So the less friction, the easier the joint is going to be to get together and take apart. So I'll put a small, you know, not even a 1/16, just like a 32nd of a little bit of a concave on each cheek of the mortise, even on the ends as well, Chiseling spruce end grain is just the worst. About the only thing harder to chisel is like cedar, because the wood is just very soft, so it kind of compresses even when you're using like a razor sharp chisel. But you just gotta do what you gotta do. Wetting it sometimes helps, but I just can't be bothered right now. So here's where the caliper comes in handy. We can adjust this to our tenon thickness here and lock it in and check here. All right, so I've marked where the tenon comes through here, and then you want to go back, I don't know, a strong 1/16 of an inch and make your mark across. That way you've got room for the tenon to tighten, right? You don't want your wedge to go in and then bottom out against the end of your mortise. You want it to wedge against the edge of the wood right here. So you want the mortise for your wedge to be past this edge right here, about a 1/16 of an inch. So if the wood shrinks at all, you can hammer that wedge in tighter and it'll tighten up the joint and won't bottom out on the end here. So I'm going to stand about a 1/4 inch shoulder right there. The other thing I want to do is pick up one thing at the top. So now we want our tenon to be, or our wedge mortise is going to be, let's say, 1 inch. And then on the bottom, we'll make it maybe 7/8 of an inch. So we've got an 1/8 of an inch taper. Actually, let's make the bottom 1 inch and the top 1 inch and 1/8, because we're okay. We use our little scribe for other side here. That's what you really gotta do. So I'm going to use a 7/16 bit. It's just a 1/16 shy of the width, so I'll have to be careful here. Then I'm going to drill from both sides again. Okay, so here's a scrap of Purple Heart. That's about a 1/2 inch thickness. I'm going to cut my wedge out of this. So we've got a 3-inch, let's make it 6 overall. Okay, then we got to the middle, so I find that I mark the center. All right, the center of where the tenon's gonna sit, which is right there. And then we're 3 inches is the width of our tenon, so I'm gonna go 1.5 inches to either side. Make it a strong 1 inch. And then 7/8, so our taper is 1/8 overall. And so then I just connect these two little marks where we're at. There's our wedge shape. So you always want to go a little bit bigger, because as you hammer it in, it's, the wood's going to compress and it'll tighten up. So you can always shave the wedge down if it's too big, right? Got our mortise piece, we got our tenon. Let's see how she fits. Pretty nice. Just like that, mortise through tenon. That is one strong joint. So you can see all the different uses for this, table legs, any kind of corner joints like this, timber frame homes, right? These are really common joints in like Dutch barns and timber frame homes all over the world in every different culture. And depending on how long your tenon is, the pull or shear strength of this is quite extreme, right? Because it has to split all that wood out in order for that to pull out. So if you have a really long tenon, and a big wedge, the amount of force that it would take to break that joint and pull it apart is it's substantial. So simple in its layout and execution, but still time consuming. It's about 4:45 now, so that took me about 2 hours. I started at 2:45. And we've got the joint all fit together with the wedge and everything 2 hours later. So now if you cut the tenon on the table saw and you use like a router jig to cut out your mortise, you'll save a significant amount of time as opposed to doing it by hand. But if all you have is hand tools, then it's still possible to make beautiful joinery. It's just going to take you more time. Tiny little hairline gap at the bottom there, but the sides are nice and tight. Anyways, guys, leave me a comment down below to let me know if you like this kind of content. If you want me to do maybe like a how-to on a complex joint, cutting it by hand, maybe once a month or every couple of weeks. These kind of videos I can make fairly easily. They're like a one-day video. So if you like this content, please give it a like. Make sure you're subscribed. Shoot me a comment down below of other stuff you'd like me to see me do to tackle by hand. Yeah, and just let me know if you like the educational content, because I'm here to share my skills. So if you're curious about any kind of techniques, make sure to leave me a comment down below, guys, and we'll see you in the next video. Samurai out.